I want to start you off today with what sounds like kind of an impossible financial riddle.
Oh, I'd love a good riddle. Let's hear it.
Right. So imagine a government stepping up to the podium, looking the public right in the eye, and proudly announcing their very first budget surplus in 7 years.
Okay, sounds like good news.
Yeah, they declared that they are entirely in the black, but,
Huh.
and here's the trick, in that exact same breath, in the exact same fiscal document, they reveal that their overall debt is like barreling straight toward $200 billion.
Wow. Yeah, that creates an immediate cognitive dissonance. I mean, you're essentially claiming that the ledger is balanced while simultaneously carrying a liability that, well, it rivals the GDP of a small nation.
Exactly. Like, how can you be in a surplus and drowning in debt at the exact same time? So, welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are unpacking the magic trick of the 2026-27 Victoria State Budget, which was just handed down on May 5th, 2026. We're tearing apart the accounting illusions to figure out the critical difference between, like, productive infrastructure debt and non-productive operational deficits.
Yeah, and to do that effectively, we really have to establish the specific political and macroeconomic context of the sources we're analyzing. Because, this budget was delivered by a Labor government sitting just ahead of a state election.
Right, which totally matters for the context.
Exactly. Because of that positioning, it features what economists recognize as classic center-left policy markers. So a preference for a larger government footprint, robust social welfare spending, and massive state-led infrastructure projects.
And just to jump in real quick, our objective here for you, the listener, is strictly analytical. We are not taking a political side.
No, not at all.
We're not evaluating whether a large state footprint is inherently good or bad. We are just mapping out the factual financial architecture of these policies just to show you what they actually mean for the state's bottom line.
Spot on. And if we're mapping the architecture, we really have to start with the front door of this budget, which is that headline claim of a return to surplus.
Right, the $727 million surplus.
Yeah. Victoria achieved an operating surplus of $727 million in the 25-26 financial year, which is a significant milestone. I mean, it's the first in 7 years.
Which is huge.
Yeah, and it makes Victoria the only state on the east coast of Australia to pull it off. And looking ahead to 26-27, they're projecting a $1.05 billion surplus.
Wait, and doesn't it grow even more after that?
It does, yeah.
What?
It's projected to grow to nearly $2 billion a year by 2029-30. The government is crediting this to broader economic growth and what they term disciplined spending. They point to over $4 billion in structural savings.
Okay, but here is the key to unlocking that riddle I posed at the start. It's all about the specific terminology, right? They are claiming an operating surplus.
Yes. The mechanism of an operating surplus is highly specific. It strictly measures day-to-day revenue, so, taxes, fees, state duties, against day-to-day operational spending.
So basically just the baseline burn rate required to keep the state functioning.
Exactly. It measures what it costs to pay the nurses, run the schools, keep the lights on, but, and this is the big but, it completely ignores capital expenditure.
Ah.
Yeah, it does not count the billions upon billions of dollars flowing out the door to fund massive infrastructure projects.
Right. So that exclusion is what really distorts the public's understanding of the state's true liquidity. Because when you reintegrate all of that capital spending back into the broader ledger, the actual cash flow for Victoria is, like, severely in the red.
Highly in the red. The sources project a hard cash deficit of $7.7 billion in 26-27 alone.
Wow.
And we also have to layer in the historical context of the baseline debt, because the current state ledger is dealing with a massive structural hangover from the pandemic.
Right, the pandemic crater.
Yeah. The data shows the pandemic created a cumulative operating deficit of over $50 billion.
That is just a staggering number. So if you combine a $50 billion historic crater with ongoing capital deficits, that $727 million surplus takes on a very different context.
It really does.
To use like a corporate analogy for you listening, it's like a tech company proudly reporting a record profit on its monthly software subscriptions, right? But they're intentionally hiding the billions of dollars they are currently borrowing to build a brand new global headquarters entirely off the main balance sheet.
That's a perfect way to look at it. The daily operations are technically profitable, but the enterprise as a whole is taking on massive leverage. And the danger of securing that operational profitability is that it provides a false sense of security.
Yeah, totally.
The day-to-day costs might be covered by current revenues, But that structural debt is sitting right there on the balance sheet, gathering momentum.
Right. But, if capital projects are hiding off the books to make the operating surplus possible, that means the surplus is entirely built on the back of daily operations. So how do you run a massive healthcare and education system and still have money left over?
Well, it's tough.
I mean, if the $50 billion pandemic loss is the historical burden, what's driving the massive scale of today's recurring expenses? Because economists classify this daily spending as non-productive debt, which sounds incredibly harsh when you look at where the money is actually
Oh,
going.
it does sound harsh.
Yeah.
But the scale is staggering because a government is fundamentally a massive service provider.
Right.
The new budget allocates $32 billion strictly for healthcare. That's a year-over-year increase of $3.9 billion.
Wow.
And education is receiving $19 billion, up by $5.5 billion. I mean, these are costs that must be serviced year after year indefinitely.
And we're also looking at a budget built around the theme, what was it? Easier, safer, more affordable.
Right, that's the slogan.
So the state is deploying billions of dollars directly into the economy to provide immediate cost of living relief to residents. We're talking about like half-price public transport, 20% refunds on vehicle registration, and heavily funded support programs for youth crime prevention and disabled children.
Yeah, they're stepping in heavily.
If you live in Victoria, the state is actively subsidizing your daily expenses.
They are. And providing that liquidity directly to households serves an immediate social function, but it creates a complex macroeconomic tension.
How so?
Well, you're injecting capital into households while trying to stabilize a state ledger. And the largest structural pressure point in that ledger is the public sector wage bill. The cost to pay all the teachers, doctors, transit workers, and state administrators currently consumes 35% of the government's total revenue.
Wait, 35% just on wages?
Just on wages.
That is wild. When I see 35% of total revenue eaten up by wages alone, my mind immediately goes to the broader structural labor market. I mean, we're looking at a post-pandemic reality where securing specialized talent, especially in healthcare and education, it requires highly competitive, inflation-adjusted union agreements.
Absolutely.
The states simply cannot function without that workforce, so they are locked into an escalating wage war just to maintain baseline services.
The reality of specialized labor scarcity forces their hand. Inflation naturally drives up the nominal cost of those union agreements, but the revenue scaling to meet those demands isn't always proportionate.
See, and this is where I want to push back on the terminology a bit, because economists look at this entire ledger, the 35% wage bill, the $32 billion for healthcare, the transit subsidies, and they slap the label non-productive debt on it.
They do, yeah.
They call it non-productive simply because it doesn't leave a physical asset behind. But if I am a listener relying on a hospital to treat my family, or my kids are sitting in those classrooms, or I'm using that 20% car registration refund to help make rent, I mean, that feels highly productive for society.
Oh, of course it does.
So why does institutional accounting view human welfare and social stability as a sunk cost?
The frustration with that terminology is incredibly common, and it highlights the friction between fiscal accounting and human capital. When an accountant labels social spending as non-productive, they aren't making a philosophical or moral judgment about the societal value of a nurse.
Right, they're just crunching numbers.
Exactly. It's a strict binary financial classification. It simply means the expenditure does not generate a direct, calculable future financial yield for the state, nor does it create a tangible, tradable physical asset that holds value on a balance sheet.
Okay, I get that.
The capital is entirely consumed in the present to maintain the current standard of living. It's a maintenance cost, basically. And that contrasts fundamentally with productive debt, which is entirely about financing future capacity.
Okay, well, let's follow that money into the future then. We've mapped out the daily operating costs, the non-productive maintenance side. The second half of this budget's dual identity is the capital expenditure. These are the massive physical projects that actually do leave a mark on the map and sit on a balance sheet.
Right. And this brings us to the core mechanism of productive debt. The underlying macroeconomic theory is that a government borrows capital to build long-term physical assets. We're talking highways, ports, energy grids, transit system.
Big stuff.
Exactly. The calculation is that these assets will permanently boost the economic capacity of the state. If you allow people to commute faster and businesses to transport goods cheaper, the overall economy expands. And the theory dictates that the resulting expansion in the tax base will eventually outpace the cost of the initial debt. In Victoria, This theory is being tested at scale through a multi-year infrastructure pipeline known as the Big Build.
The big build. And the most glaring high-profile example of this strategy in the sources is the suburban rail loop. The budget reveals that this single project requires an additional $11 billion in funding.
That's a massive price tag.
Yeah, and to secure that capital, the government is utilizing a mechanism called forward debt. They are essentially issuing government bonds and taking out massive institutional loans right now that are scheduled to be amortized and paid off over the next 40 years.
Yeah, forward debt is an incredibly aggressive financial maneuver. By issuing 40-year bonds, the state is locking in present-day yields and actively shifting the ultimate liquidity burden to taxpayers in the 2060s.
Wow, the 2060s.
Yeah, it beautifully illustrates the intense duality of this budget. The government is operating almost like a hyper-growth tech startup.
Oh, I like that comparison.
They're burning through capital right now to subsidize their current user base with transit discounts and vehicle registration refunds, while simultaneously pouring billions of dollars of borrowed capital into their underlying infrastructure, betting that their future market dominance will pay off the massive initial burn rate.
Right. But with a tech startup, the investors take the risk. With forward debt, the future taxpayers take the risk.
Exactly.
I mean, is forward debt just a polite, politically palatable way of saying we are making our grandchildren pay for this train? Or is there a genuine economic mandate for it since, those grandchildren will theoretically be the ones riding the train to work?
Well, the concept you're touching on is known as intergenerational equity. The proponents of 40-year forward debt argue that if a physical asset, like a railway, is going to generate economic utility for the state for the next century, it's fundamentally disproportionate to force the taxpayers of 2026 to foot the entire bill.
Right. That would be impossible anyway.
Yeah. By spreading the bond servicing over 4 decades, you align the financial cost with the generations who actually extract value from the asset.
Okay, but the fatal flaw in that logic seems to be the assumption of permanent utility. Like, what happens to intergenerational equity if the macroeconomic landscape completely shifts?
Which it often does.
Right. We just lived through a pandemic that permanently altered global commuting patterns. If remote work and decentralized cities become the norm, a multi-billion-dollar rail loop might be functionally obsolete in 25 years.
That is a very real possibility.
And then you've locked future generations into mandatory bond payments for an asset that isn't delivering the projected economic yield. If that happens, the grandchildren are just left holding a very expensive bag.
The risk of asset obsolescence is the great gamble of forward debt. You are projecting 40 years of stable economic utility in an era of rapid technological and social disruption. If the asset fails to catalyze the expected growth, it stops being productive debt and simply becomes a structural financial burden.
And the sheer size of that burden is where this deep dive gets mathematically terrifying.
It does get scary.
Because we have daily non-productive operations straining the baseline, and we have massive productive infrastructure gambles driving up long-term borrowing. When you aggregate all of this, the absolute debt figures are just staggering. Net debt is climbing from $165.3 billion today to $175.6 billion by the end of 26-27.
And climbing.
Yeah, it's projected to hit $199.3 billion, so functionally $200 billion by 2029-30. And if you pull back and look at gross debt, we're talking about a $244 billion liability. How does a government logically defend borrowing on that scale while simultaneously boasting about a surplus?
Well, they execute that defense by changing the mathematical lens through which the public views the liability.
Okay, how so?
The core argument from the Treasury is that evaluating an absolute dollar amount in a vacuum is economically illiterate. Instead, they require the markets and the public to focus on the ratio of the total debt compared to the gross state product, or the GSP.
Which is just the total economic output of Victoria.
just-
I mean, I'm looking at a $244 billion gross debt projection, and my immediate instinct is panic. But I know sovereign entities and state governments don't manage debt like a household does, right? They're banking entirely on the fact that the economic pie is growing fast enough to dwarf the size of the debt slice.
That ratio is the entire foundation of their fiscal credibility. The raw dollar amount of the debt is undeniably rising at a rapid pace. But the state's total economic output is also expanding.
So they balance each other out.
In theory, yes. When you measure the debt strictly as a percentage of the broader economy, the trajectory changes. According to the Treasury projections, the debt-to-GSP ratio will peak at 24.9% in the 26-27 financial year. And crucially, they project it will then stabilize and actually dip slightly to 24.4% by 2029-30.
So their argument is basically, look, yes, my mortgage went from $500,000 to $1 million, but I also got a massive promotion at work, so as a percentage of my income, the debt is exactly the same.
That is the exact macroeconomic logic they use. And it allows the government to confidently project stability to bond markets and rating agencies, even as the raw liability approaches $250 billion.
Yeah, but the vulnerability in that logic, I think, is that ratios don't pay the bills.
They certainly don't.
At a certain point, the sheer absolute size of the raw number has to become a problem completely, regardless of how big the GSP gets. You still have to physically service a $200 billion net debt. You have to actually pay the interest.
Yes, and the cost of servicing the debt is the ultimate stress test for this entire budget. The focus on ratios can obscure the immediate liquidity drain of interest payments. Because even if the debt-to-GSP ratio remains perfectly flat at 24% for the next decade, the actual cash required to service the yield on $200 billion is astronomical.
Give us the numbers. How bad is it?
In 26-27, the interest payments alone will cost Victoria $6.8 billion.
Oh, wow.
And it gets worse. By 2029-30, as the forward debt compounds, that number snowballs to $11.8 billion a year.
$11.8 billion. I ran the math on that $11.8 billion projection before we started recording. And when you break that down into a daily run rate, it equates to $32 million.
That's a lot of money.
Every single day. $32 million every day flowing straight out of the state's coffers just to service the interest. That money isn't laying a single mile of new rail track. It isn't hiring a single new specialized nurse. It is simply the daily fee paid to the bond markets for the privilege of carrying the leverage.
It's sobering. And the compounding nature of that interest is where the Macroeconomic High-Wire Act suddenly impacts the everyday listener's cost of living. A state government operates with a finite pool of annual revenue.
Right, there's only so much tax money to go around.
Exactly. Every single dollar that gets swallowed by that snowballing $11.8 billion interest payment is a dollar that physically cannot be deployed elsewhere. It is capital actively withheld from funding the 35% public sector wage bill.
Right.
It's capital that cannot be used to sustain the 20% vehicle registration refunds or to prop up the $32 billion healthcare system.
So the interest essentially becomes a parasite on the daily operating budget.
In the strict accounting terms we defined earlier, bond servicing is the ultimate non-productive expense. It yields absolutely zero future capacity for the state, and it actively cannibalizes the present-day liquidity required to maintain social stability.
Man. So if we pull all of these complex mechanisms together, we are looking at a budget that is essentially a high-stakes, multi-decade balancing act.
That's exactly what it is.
You have a government desperately trying to manage the necessary but non-productive daily survival of the state. They are navigating the structural hangover of a $50 billion pandemic loss, funding a $32 billion healthcare system, and managing a massive inflation-adjusted public sector wage bill.
Yep.
And simultaneously, they're executing massive productive gambles on the future, utilizing 40-year forward debt for mega projects like the rail loop, basically betting the house that the resulting infrastructure will grow the GSP faster than the bond yields compound.
It is a fascinating and highly precarious fiscal position. And I think it leaves us with an incredibly important macroeconomic question to consider as these policies play out.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if a government successfully manages to stabilize its debt-to-economy ratio on paper, but the raw absolute interest payments on that debt eventually grow so large that they start cannibalizing the daily budget for schools, hospitals, and basic public services, is that debt truly productive? Or has the shining infrastructure of tomorrow been built by quietly bankrupting the essential services of today?
Wow, that is the exact question you have to ask when you look past the political headline of a surplus. You have to look at the structural deficit, you have to look at the forward debt, and you definitely have to look at the daily cost of the interest.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Victoria State budget. To all of you listening, keep questioning the mechanisms behind the numbers. And the next time you hear a politician solve a complex financial riddle with a single word like surplus, remember to ask them what they left off the balance sheet.